Welcome to Live with Lewis for July 29th, 2004. Hi, I'm Tim Gore, enrichment teacher for the School District of Clayton, Missouri, and part of your Lewis and Clark Then and Now education team, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's webcast from Omaha, Nebraska, named for the Omaha tribe, one of the native tribes of the area. The Missouri tribe, the Oto tribe, and the Pawnees were also native to this area. And of course, this is the area of the country in Council Bluffs where the first council of the expedition occurred, where members of the Oto Missouri tribe met with Lewis and Clark. And we're going to have an opportunity to feature that in next week's webcast when we come to you from Fort Atkinson. We're here today at NP Dodge Park and Marina in just north of Omaha. And it's been very exciting for us to come to Omaha because this is the headquarters for the National Park Service Lewis and Clark Historic Trail. And of course, through their Challenge Cost Share grant program, they've provided the sponsorship which makes all these webcasts possible. And we're extremely happy to be able to see the faces of those people and to actually tour their new fantastic facility, which is right along the Missouri River here in Omaha. And you're going to have a chance to see images of that as well today. Omaha is experiencing its sesquicentennial this year. Its 150th birthday, in the same year that the nation commemorates the 200th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition. A variety of famous Americans you may be familiar with are born in Omaha. Actor Marlon Brando, political activist Malcolm X, and of course, major financier today Warren Buffett are just three to name a few, as well as famous artist Suzette LaFlèche. We're very pleased that you can join us, and we want to hear your email questions. I want to hear that ding come across the computer during this webcast. So send us your questions to Lewis and Clark at clayton.k12.mo.us. That's spelled out, Lewis and Clark at clayton.k12.mo.us, and we welcome your email questions during today's webcast. We're going to feature today the Missouri River then and now, talk about a little bit of the changes that have occurred in its 200 years, and it's the issues facing the river today, including environmental, recreation, economic interests, as we meet Paul Johnston from the United States Army Corps of Engineers. Today I'm happy now to turn it over to Scott Mandrell, portraying Meriwether Lewis for the Discovery Expedition, to find out what happened in the journals 200 years ago and what happened this week on the river.
Thank you, Tim. As you remember, last week we joined you from a variety of locations. Last week we broadcast out of Nebraska City at the new Flora and Fauna Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center there, featuring a lot of flora and fauna. I was in Montana last week doing some preparatory work for next year's broadcast, and we were able to rejoin the crew as we made our way on up the river. I want to talk a little bit about the last week historically. When we talked to you last, we were down by the Nishnabotna River, is where we were operating out of below current Nebraska City, Nebraska. And at that point, we were up the mouth of the Nishnabotna just a little bit, which of course the original Corps had passed by, and Lewis had explored up some distance 200 years ago. Now this was, at that point, the Corps was certainly aware that they were entering into a particularly important place on the river, a place that would ultimately have historical significance for our country for some time to come, and a place that was of tremendous importance to the native people as well. We were just below the Platte River at that time and and the original expedition at that particular juncture was just below the Platte. And certainly they were aware of the Platte. Indeed, they were aware largely of the river's features and tributaries all the way to the Mandan villages when they ascended it 200 years ago. And the Platte was a special place for the original expedition. At least it had intended to have been a milestone for them. The original plan that Lewis and Clark had for the Corps was to send back some initial reports from the mouth of the Platte with a small group of soldiers in one of the pirogues. That decision, however, was ultimately scrapped as they realized that it was more important to the expedition to actually keep those men with them, and ultimately that probably was a wise choice for a variety of reasons, not simply what they were going to encounter as they continued up the river that year, but ultimately into the year of '05 as they made their way from the Mandan villages to the ocean. So historically speaking, the Corps is moving still along an area where they have yet to encounter Native Americans. They are still really contending with the river, and that is the major player in terms of the character that they're encountering along the way. It is that natural phenomenon of the river. As Tim mentioned, we're going to be talking about that more and more. The original expedition finally arrived at the mouth of the Platte. They were shocked by and write extensively about that river, and they talk, maybe shocked is a strong word, but they were certainly taken aback by it. It was a unique river. It had a lot of features that were unique to it. It had a tremendous amount of sand being discharged at its mouth into the main body and current of the Missouri River, and that was a change for them. They'd been in this muddy-bottomed Missouri River, and when they encountered the Platte River, they do write at length about the features that distinguish it from the Missouri. Beyond that, they made their way then up a little bit further. They talk about the fact that for the first time since they passed the Nottoway River, they start to see high ground on the starboard side, which would be the eastern side of the river as they were ascending. A lot of the high hills had been back away from the river as they had been moving up since the Nottoway, just above what we today would think of as St. Joseph, Missouri, and really there was no high ground on the right-hand side until about this area, and they start to approach, and they see that high ground approaching, and they make note of those land formations as well. And on the 27th of July of 1804, William Clark and Reuben Field actually go ashore to take a look at some old mounds that were attributed to an ancient or abandoned old Oto tribal village that had been located along the larboard side or western side of the river. That location that they went ashore on the 27th of July is what we now call Omaha, Nebraska. It is the city of Omaha, Nebraska. So that's an interesting date in the annals of the story. As well, on the 28th, they finally actually make contact with Native Americans. They run into a Missouri Indian who has been living with an Oto village that's about 4 miles inland on the western side of the river, and ultimately that Missouri tribal member who is living there with the Oto is brought back. It actually talks with the members of the expedition. They find out a tremendous amount of information, and they actually start to orchestrate the first council. This is where they send word back to the tribes that are in the area, to the tribal presence in the area, that they are eager to have a council with them and to actually meet with the chiefs and the representatives of the tribe. So we're getting into a new phase, and indeed, in the journals, the Platte River actually is sort of a point of demarcation. There is a significant change both in the features of the river and as well this human dynamic of Native American interaction. So it's an exciting time for the original expedition. It's been an exciting time for us as well. And we're going to take a little bit of a look at some of the footage from what's happened to us over the last week as well, and we'll try to describe some of those things. You'll be seeing land formations and features that are very similar to those that the original expedition saw. And it's been an exciting week for us. So if Jim will roll that now, we'll talk a little bit about what we've seen. Now, as we left the mouth of the Nishnabotna, here's Frank Wesley from the Missouri Department of, Missouri Parks and Recreation, and involved there with the Department of Conservation. There's here is Ralph Duran, who traveled with us along the Missouri River, and we certainly appreciate Ralph, and we're presenting him with a plaque there. Frank was thanking us for the work that we had done as we moved through
Discovery
Missouri.
Expedition of St. Charles, Missouri, and especially the crew of the Keelboat Columbia and the two Pirogues.
Here's Captain Clark presenting a special award of recognition to Captain Cox of the Missouri Water Patrol, thanking them for their assistance as we made our way
The
along.
Discovery Expedition of St. Charles has fulfilled its goals of providing a rich and genuine living history experience and of promoting education and study of American history.
And here we are now. We've moved up to the Plattsmouth, and this is a new marina that's being developed at Plattsmouth, Nebraska, and these folks there were very accommodating to us. As you can see, the terrain features are changing. There's a lot of low-lying, unforested, unwooded ground around the river now, and that is typical of the area we're getting into. And there you see the river and its changing features. We also passed the Platte, just above Plattsmouth. Of course, Plattsmouth named for the mouth of the Platte, and the Platte River today holds a lot of the characteristics of the original river as well. And here we are at Bellevue. This is Bellevue, Nebraska, and you're going to see just a moment. Here is the art wall. This is a wall filled with art done by kids from around the country, and we're going to be on August 4th actually doing a special broadcast highlighting this wall and some of the work that was done by students across the country. And it's an interesting story how these young people and their artwork have come together on this one place to sort of tell the story from a kid's perspective visually. And here we are in the morning at Bellevue, preparing to make our way then on up toward the city of Omaha. And this was an exciting day for us. Just yesterday, as we broke camp at the city of Bellevue, where Offutt Air Force Base is located, and made our way in the early morning light onto the river. And as we moved up the river, we were very, very pleased. As in the original journals, it talks about the southerly winds that start to afford themselves to the men of the expedition, and we were enjoying those winds as well. And here we are in downtown Omaha. You'll see a beautiful sculpture here done at the Lewis and Clark Landing on the waterfront with the new National Park Service building in the back there. And we were very, very fortunate. Those southerly winds came up, and we decided that we would take advantage of them, and indeed we did. We dropped our sails, and here you're about to see the three boats of the expedition completely under sail yesterday. We moved under sail exclusively, and it was a tremendous opportunity for us to take advantage of the southerly winds and enjoy the silence of sailing. And as you can see here, we're entering the city of Omaha. There's the 80 and 480 bridge making our way into the city. And it's exciting for the crew and exciting for the people of Omaha as well to witness what had not happened for 200 years, to see the 65-foot wooden keelboat and 2 pirogues make their way with nothing other than wind power to the downtown area there. And of course, the cannon salutes being part of our hallmark signature arrival at different places along the way, and we were excited to arrive in the town of Omaha, the city of Omaha, which is a spectacular town. And as we stopped there, we had a special presentation with the folks from the National Park Service who have been instrumental in making this project possible. So just a moment here, you'll see several representatives. Dave Given of the National Park Service will be presented with an award by Captain Clark and the men of the expedition. There, very quickly before we go in, covering all of this, Jim Sturm on one of the chase boats, doing a lot of the photography, and Tim Gore at the camera on shore is capturing him for a change. And here we are coming aboard coming ashore at Miller's Landing, one of the many Omaha City Park facilities there at Miller's Landing, where they have the Spirit of the Omaha, which is an excursion boat. And those good folks were kind enough to take the excursion boat out, allow us to land there. And here you see us removing the Department of the Interior flag from the white boat. The white boat was the boat that penetrated the interior of the North American continent the furthest, and so we flew it yesterday as we entered the city of Omaha. And that, along with several other presentations, were made to the National Park Service and the people of Omaha. And here you see the Corps coming ashore for those presentations. And the Department of Interior flag would then be presented along with a plaque to Dave Gibbons.
Presented to the people of Omaha, 28th of July, 2004. In recognition of the 200th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark Expedition's arrival at this place, the 27th of July, 1804. 3 cheers for the people of Omaha! Hip hip! Hurrah! Hip hip! Hurrah! Hip hip! Hurrah!
And so today we thought it was appropriate, as we entered the port of Omaha, to have the white boat flying the flag of the Department of the Interior. And we'd like to present that flag in a commemorative flag case to Mr. Gibbons from the National Park Service at this time as a token of our esteem and appreciation. And if you would, sir, I'd like to just read what the inscription says for the folks here. It says, presented to the National Park Service, Midwest Region, and Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail by Discovery Expedition of St. Charles, Missouri. And here's some final images. There's the white pirogue with the Department of the Interior flag flying on it, and the sail fully billowed with wind. And there, of course, the red pirogue. Just to let you folks out there who have been sort of curious about the boats, yesterday we were making a little over 2.5 miles under sail power alone, about 2.5 miles per hour yesterday, just with the propulsion of the wind in our sails. So it was an exciting day for us, and there you see the National Park Service building in the background. So that's a little bit about what's happened to us over the past week. It's been an exciting week. There is a change taking place. We're entering Indian country, the traditional homeland of the Pawnee, Missouri, Oto, and the Omaha, and we're very excited about that. This next week we're going to be engaging with Native Americans during the signature event up at Boyer Chute, Fort Calhoun, and we're out at Macy on the reservation, the Omaha reservation there, and so it's we're about to enter a very different and exciting chapter of the story. I would just, as one little piece of business here, remind you, our Lewis and Clark at clayton.k12.mo.us is where we'd like you to send your emails if you're interested in asking questions during today's broadcast. And I would also mention, just as a technical note to our technical director, Jim Sturm, that our time clock is not working, just so that we're aware of that. And that does sometimes affect us, and we appreciate you all joining us again today. And we especially appreciate today Paul Johnson from the United States Army Corps of Engineers for joining us today. And want to welcome you, Paul, to the broadcast today, and thank you for being here and taking time out of your schedule to join us and help us understand a little more about the rivers.
Well, Captain Lewis, it's a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you. If you could please, just to let our audience, we always try to let them know who it is they're hearing from, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what role you play with the Corps of Engineers?
Well, my name is Paul Johnston, and I am the Chief of Public Affairs for the Northwestern Division of the Corps of Engineers. It so happens that our division encompasses the whole route of Lewis and Clark from St. Louis to Astoria.
Okay, very good.
And over the years, obviously, the river has changed many times, but I'm the public affairs officer here in Omaha, and the center that we have for managing the dams and reservoirs for the Missouri is located here in Omaha.
Right, and we certainly appreciate it. I know that the Omaha is stamped on a lot of those river charts we use. We know that you all are up here working hard to make the rivers navigable. Tell us a little bit about one of the things, and we've done broadcast actually right before we left the Wood River this past year. We did a broadcast that featured Corps of Engineers and some issues there. Particularly then we talked about the lock and dam systems and that sort of thing. But if you would please again share with our audience what the charter of the Corps of Engineers is. Why does the Corps exist? When was it started? What is its purpose? How has its purpose changed from early on to today?
Well, the Corps of Engineers started at the Battle of Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill. And when the first engineer built fortifications during the Revolutionary War. Following the war in 1805, there was no engineering school in the United States. So West Point, when it was constructed as a military school, was the first engineering college in the country. So the Corps, for its first many years, was mostly involved in fortifications, both on the coastlines and interior. Over time, as rivers became more and more important to be able to move equipment and troops, the Corps of Engineers was brought in to make sure that these waterways were navigable. Also got into the business of building some roads. The Cumberland Road was built by the Corps of Engineers. So from its very beginning, it had a role in what we call civil works, the navigability of waterways, and as that applies to national defense. Over the years, it has become a great place for a lot of engineering expertise that can be mobilized during the war. And in more modern times, all the facilities that were built in Saudi Arabia back in the 1980s that the first Gulf War was conducted, all those facilities were built by the Corps of Engineers. But in the Missouri Basin, we have over the years built 6 large dams on the Missouri that provide flood control and hydropower, and a list of 8 authorized purposes, and to make sure that there's water supply and power for the people in the basin, and obviously outside the basin too, where that power is marketed over time.
Okay, well, very good. You mentioned the Missouri River Basin. That is the focus of our broadcast today, and obviously it's the majority of the route that Lewis and Clark traveled across the interior of the country, and of course it's the route that we're following today, and we've talked about this a great deal over the many months that we've been doing this. That obviously the river is very different than it was, and there were challenges and obstacles that faced the original expedition, and of course we also face a set of challenges and obstacles, some of them the same, some of them very different. But let's talk about, if you will, and I mentioned passing the mouth of the Platte the other day, and the fact that when it was very exciting for us, we took a pirogue, as they did, about a mile up, and many of us got out and walked another half mile in the river, and that's a waist-deep river, and still filled with snags and sandbars and things like that. And we don't have any images yet. I think we're going to have some we're going to be able to post on the website for folks to actually see that. I think they'd be shocked when they see that river and understand that you can stand in the middle of that river and walk all the way up it, essentially. Very different river. But if you would sort of paint a visual picture for our audience members about what the Missouri would have looked like 200 years ago.
Well, the Missouri was about 3 times wider than it is today. It was on average about 0.6 of a mile wide, and today it's about 1/3 of a mile wide.
Now we're talking about right here specifically, largely.
It varied
sure.
on and off for its entire length. Some places wider, some places narrower. The velocities varied a lot. Today it runs at approximately 5 miles an hour.
And could you also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but and again, it's very important, and we're trying to make sure that they have an understanding of this, our audience members, but beyond we talk about the river, but then we also have to talk about, in those days, sort of beyond the river, an extensive floodplain many times.
The floodplain for the Missouri varies from less than a mile to many miles in parts of the river, especially down in central Missouri. It may be 8-10 miles wide from bluff to bluff. Around here it's a little bit narrow, probably the floodplain is probably in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 miles from the bluff line in western Iowa over to the hills here in on the Omaha side. The river was quite sinuous. It moved a lot. And of course, the river has always been very changeable from the time that Lewis and Clark came through in 1804 to the mid-1880s. The river shortened all by itself about 75 miles.
And we're going to talk about that. So if we could just take you back, and I apologize there for getting a little off of that, but again, it's so important because people today, they ask us about the river, and we try to communicate to them that it is a very different river than it was. Now, you started to talk about the speed of the flow. Let's pick up there again.
Well, the velocity of the flow of the river is about 5 miles an hour, and during Clark's time, it varied from as much, he measured it as fast as 23 miles an hour to something, in the neighborhood of maybe 3 miles an hour. They found that the lower end of the river was much faster than it was as it got above the Platte. Clark later wrote that the most difficult part of the journey was actually navigating the river, because it was a difficult exercise. The river today is much cleaner than it was
sediment-wise
than it was then, because the system of dams captures all that sediment in Montana, North and South Dakota, rather than discharging it all the way down. Now, the sediment load certainly picks up as the below the Platte, because the Platte does carry a lot of sediment. It picks up sediment all the way from Colorado and moves it down to the river.
Okay, and so we understand, and so we're kind of having an understanding of that, and one of the other things, and we talk to people about this, that for us, our challenge a lot of times, and as you pointed out, that the flow of the river, while it may have changed in certain places and all, what we contend with today may not necessarily be in all places necessarily a faster current than what they dealt with. And we try to explain to people when sometimes they ask us about our ability to conduct this movement in a similar fashion to the original expedition. And indeed, yesterday, as you saw there, we were under sail power, so that was something that was, little has changed with regard to the wind and the surface of the water. But with regard to things like poling, for example, obviously they were poling up a very different river, a shallow river. And really for us, the challenge is the depth. I mean, that's what precludes us from doing this. So obviously the depth, this is a self-scouring channel out here, and if you could maybe talk to that issue a little bit, so folks understand again the depth of the river 200 years ago, the depth of it now, and how that's come to pass.
Over time, the banks of the river have been armored. There's been rocks put essentially from Sioux City all the way to St. Louis to cut down on stream bank erosion and to help in flood control, because it moves the water a little bit faster. So over time, the river has become steeper. So poling or having men on the ground pulling on ropes would be much more difficult today than it was then, even though they were stomping through.
I need 30-foot men.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were slogging through the mud and the mosquitoes, and that would have been really, really difficult work. But the river has, in that regard, the slope of the sides of the river are much steeper today than it was 200 years ago.
And so let's talk again a little bit about, now we'll start moving into this sort of the evolution of the Missouri River. You mentioned the fact that the Missouri River, just in that period that you mentioned earlier, had shortened by about 70 miles, and that was largely a natural phenomenon. And but obviously, 200 years after the original expedition, we are looking at a river that has changed both because of natural phenomena as well as human intervention. And obviously our Lewis and Clark is the focus of what we're doing, and many of our listeners and viewers are familiar with the journals, and they know that in actually prior to the expedition actually getting to the Mandan villages, they had speculated that it was about 1,500 miles to the Mandan villages. Then of course they actually took those measurements and mileages along the way and determined it was 1,609 miles from the mouth of the Missouri to the mouth of the Knife River, essentially where the Mandan villages were. And that today is about 1,350, almost 1,360 miles. but nonetheless, we're talking about almost 300 miles shorter, or 250 miles shorter, that the river has done. So explain to us a little bit about how this has happened. How do you go from a 1,609 mile length of river to a 1,350 mile length of river?
Well, the real short answer is the river was very sinuous, just lots and lots of bends.
Right.
And starting about 1912, that's when the Corps started doing some real work on the river. The Corps of Engineers originally got involved on the Missouri in the mid-1830s, pulling snags out of the river so that the people who followed Lewis and Clark, the miners and the campers and the trappers and the settlers, could get up safely. River boats went as far north as Fort Benton, Montana. In about 1912, then the Corps started some work down towards Kansas City, and in this area up here was more done in the 1930s, where what we call controlled dikes were built into the river. In fact,
right. In fact, I think we're going to start. Let's go ahead and go to some of the images right now to help people understand.
Well, go back to number one then, I guess. This is kind of what the river looked like in the early about 1934.
Prior to channelization.
Prior to channelization in this stretch of the river. And you can see it was pretty wide, and you can see a lot of sandbars out there. Can you go to the next one, please? You can see the start of the work is these, in the upper right-hand corner, you see these structures that are put into the river, kind of perpendicular to the flow. And as those structures, they're pilings that were put into the river and rock, and that slowed the river down, and the sediment would fall out and begin to fill in behind it. Next, please. It's hard for me to see, but you can see that the river the sediment is building up behind those structures. Next. There, it's much clearer there that you can see that the sediment is building up, and then the channel is kind of over there to the left side of the river, or the image, and you can see that it all fills in. Next. And
there's actually some land forming there.
Yeah, this is all land forming, and we're about up into about 1936 there. It takes a while to do this.
Now, this is down by Indian Cave State Park, just above the Kansas-Nebraska border, correct?
Yeah, it's at mile 517, right near what is today Corning, Iowa. And there you can see that that's about 1947. The river has completely filled in there on the right-hand side, and vegetated. Later on, that land all has become some of the richest farmland on the planet.
You bet. And could we go to the next image, or was there another one there that could give us a more contemporary look at that area there? I think we've got one more on there, Jim. Is that all we've got? Okay, very good.
And so that was part of where the river was filled in, and then in other places where you had all those bends, some of them were cut off.
Natural, like a chute would form?
Yeah, it was done mechanically that the river has historically done on its own. In fact, Carter Lake here in Omaha was once an oxbow of the Missouri.
And indeed, in the middle of Omaha is a piece of Iowa, which is a strange phenomenon.
That's exactly correct. The river channel had shifted. In fact, there are a number of places along the river. Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri all have what are called boundary commissions to work out who pays the taxes on which side of the river.
Okay, well, speaking of paying bills and talking about, you mentioned earlier, alluded to, the navigability and that sort of thing. Let's talk a little bit about, obviously part of the Corps of Engineers mandate, and it's important and I try to remind people of this, is the fact that the Corps of Engineers is not just simply making these decisions. You're carrying out the mandate of the Congress and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important for people to understand that you folks aren't just doing things willy-nilly.
No, in fact, it has. Anytime that the Corps has a job to go out and do something like this, it goes through the Congress twice. First to get the project authorized, and the second one time to get it funded. So no, the Corps doesn't go out and do this all by itself.
Well, we know that obviously river navigation and commercial navigation was a big impetus for a lot of this work that was done early on. So we're going to talk a little bit about barge traffic. We're going to look at it right now. Here's some barges moving on the Missouri River, and all the way, essentially from Sioux City down, is a navigable river. Although, and we're going to talk about this, there have been a lot of court cases, there have been a lot of issues between the environmental concerns and the commercial navigation concerns. Can you talk to us a little bit about, of course, I grew up on the Mississippi River, and we came down the Ohio last year where we were just inundated with commercial traffic. And we actually have a question here that from Charles, one of our internet viewers, and it says, how much barge traffic goes up and down the Missouri River in the Omaha area? And I'd speak to that first of all, that since we've entered the mouth of the Missouri River on the 14th of May, that I can tell you, Charles, that we have two, now we're just now in the Omaha area, but we have only passed approximately 12 commercial tows that we're actually navigating. Now that does not include cement barges, dredge barges they're operating in a localized area. But we've only passed about 12 commercial tows in the entire time we've been on the river.
Yeah, this year has been a very, very difficult year for the commercial navigation folks. On average, well, the peak tonnage for the Missouri was 1977. The commercial guys moved about 3.3 million tons, which pales compared to the Mississippi. But as you know, the Missouri is a much different river. It's narrower, it's faster, it bends more. But because of continued drought, we've been maintaining only minimum flows for the navigators. There have been lawsuits that we stopped completely navigating for a period of time last summer. This year, because of the economic forces, one company completely went out of business, and they've been 4 generations on the river they have been navigating.
While you're continuing to talk, I'm going to ask Jim to go ahead and kind of scroll through some of these images that actually show us what's happening on the river. And you can talk to these as well as we go through them, but please continue to talk about the river and the navigation as well as flood control.
Well, so the navigation this year, the commercial guys said that they were only going to operate from St. Louis to Kansas City, and that's where the majority of the tonnage you saw this year, moving cement, fertilizer, that sort of thing, asphalt on the lower end of the river. There hasn't been any traffic from Kansas City to Sioux City so far. We're expecting some limited traffic later this year.
And we're seeing, is this a power plant? Or
this is a coal-fired power plant here in Nebraska, or right here in Omaha. That's Omaha Public Power. There are 20 power plants from Sioux City to St. Louis.
And is this coal coming in by barge?
The coal all comes in by train, and what they use the Missouri River for cooling water. It's brought in. It helps cool the equipment and then discharge back into the river. And they have permits that go back one, please.
And this is a nuclear power plant,
This is a nuclear power plant up at Fort Calhoun, really not very far from Fort Atkinson, where you'll be the signature event this weekend. There are 2 nuclear power plants here in Nebraska. There's Fort Calhoun just north of town, and there's another one, Brownville,
right.
that you passed.
And they're also using the river as a cooling mechanism?
Yes, they use river water for cooling. They have extra permit requirements that come from the Nuclear Regulatory Agency that controls the temperature of the water that goes into the reservoir. And that's one of the contentions over very low flows in the summertime. The power plants are concerned about their impact.
Now, I know that the Corps and the Corps, as I mentioned, is always caring about the mandate of the people, the will of the people, and the congressional mandates. And obviously, environmental concerns have been a big issue. And I know certainly down where we live at the other end of the river, the Pallid Sturgeon issue has been a large part of this. And first of all, I think it's important. People may have heard, Pallid Sturgeon, but I don't know that everyone has seen one. I was going to ask Jim if he would show the folks what a Pallid Sturgeon is.
27. This is a picture of a Pallid Sturgeon. It looks very much like its first cousin, the shovel nose, which is much more common. Its color obviously is a tip-off. Can you go to the next one? You can see that it is really quite white, and there are some differences in the barbels, those little appendages that come down below. That's how they sense their food.
Yeah, and we remind our viewers that in the journals, when they get to this area, they talk about catching the white catfish. and they have white catfish camp. And so fishing and fish in this particular area we're in, and particularly these albino or lightly colored fish are becoming a part of the story. So we're in an area where fish are particularly of interest, and the Pallid Sturgeon, of course, is just another part of that story.
There are big catfish that people are catching them around here all the time. In fact, there was one here just recently that weighed over 80 pounds that they caught just down towards the Platte.
Right, and they mentioned just about that area, about the white catfish camp, getting a quart of oil from the fat of that fish. But here, the Pallid Sturgeon now is an endangered species, and it's caused a lot of concern among the environmental community, certainly.
That's correct. What we don't know about the Pallid Sturgeon really fills volumes. Can I have the 29, please? As I said, its first cousin, the shovelnose, is reproducing in the wild. They're having a very difficult time with the pallid, and we don't really know why. What's different? They are so close genetically that they will crossbreed. We know that probably the swiftness of the channel, or the lack of backwater habitat, is probably a big reason for their difficulty in reproducing these days.
Now, the Department of Conservation of Missouri is actually opening up creating some backwater areas. They're busting holes in some of the dikes. Absolutely. And they're clearing some land, and there's been a real concerted effort. In fact, of course, all those trees they cleared were the ones that we had to navigate past there in mid-May. But there are steps being taken to create an environment for the Pallid Sturgeon to spawn.
Matter of fact, this year the Corps of Engineers, in cooperation with the state of Missouri and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we spent $23 million. A major portion of that was to build shallow water habitat along the river for the Pallid Sturgeon. In addition, we built some sandbars for the terns and the plovers, and we'll get into those guys in just a minute. And also to help the Fish and Wildlife Service expand and modernize its hatchery program. In fact, there are going to be Pallid Sturgeons stocked at Boyer Chute, just north of town, next week. They come from the hatchery up in outside of Garrison, North Dakota. I mentioned the interior least tern and the piping plover.
And of course there's our men firing off the blunderbuss in the background. Why don't we as well? We've got those images as well for you there, Paul.
22, please. This is a piping plover. It's a little bitty bird. It's only about 4 or 5 inches tall. They and the terns nest on barren sandbars, with sparse vegetation. They won't nest where there's lots of vegetation because that's where the predators hide. Right. Their nest just is made of just a scrape in the sand.
Divot in the sand.
They rely on their camouflage for protection. You get a sandbar that's 2 or 3 acres in size, and just these eggs that are only about as big as a quail egg, and they look just like the sand, and that's their protection. Go ahead, 23, please. This is a defense mechanism that the plover uses, making it look like it's harmed, and so mom will take a predator away from the nest by doing that. Next, please. This is an interior least tern, again on one of the islands, approaching her nest. Next, please. That's a chick and an egg, and you can see how it just absolutely blends into that sand in the background. Next, please. And one of the differences between the two birds is that the plover eats invertebrates and small insects. The tern, on the other hand, catches small fish and feeds its young. So they need kind of a mix of habitat. They kind of need to be near the water, and that the terns are much more dependent upon raising the young than the plovers are. It's really interesting that up at Ponca, just north of here, we did a lot of
where there are some sandbars.
That's correct, and we created several very large sandbars this year while we were dredging some areas to create shallow water habitat for the Pallid Sturgeon. We took the sand and moved it out into the river and created 2 large sandbars. The bulldozer was still spreading the sand around when the birds came in to start nesting. So we had to shut the operation down.
Yeah, nature is very resilient. We've seen evidence of that.
Well, what was really encouraging about it is that not only did they nest, but they're staying there, which indicates that there's food for them. And because otherwise, if it's just a sterile sandbar, then they're not going to stay.
Right. And I think, again, when we try to talk about this, obviously there, so for so long it had always been characterized as competing interests between commercial navigation, environmental issues, and I will say that we certainly have been sort of eyewitnesses to years and years and years of this, as we have been on our to date 8-year odyssey of traveling these rivers and telling the story of Lewis and Clark and the story of the Missouri River, and there's definitely a much more positive environment today, it seemingly, and I think people are aware that there is a way for these interests to work together and people to find some middle ground to both maintain the navigation aspect. And you'll see in the background a number of recreational vessels, and certainly recreation is a big part of the river, but at the same time doing all of that with the environment in mind and finding those ways to work together in partnerships.
We are absolutely convinced that the only way that we're going to come to be able to live on the Missouri and realize its potential is to find ways to help recover the species and still realize the many other benefits that the river provides. And all it takes is the will. It's not terribly difficult engineering wise. You've seen the work that the mitigation projects have been happening over the last several years. There's much more emphasis. We built about 1,400 acres of shallow water habitat this year. That's a down payment on 20,000 acres that will be built over the next 20 years for the full length of the river. We're looking at building some sandbars for the terns and plovers. One of the great ironies is that with the drought, the big reservoirs up north are down about 30 feet, and the plovers love nesting in the reservoirs. So
So it's working out. Well, very good. We do have to, in the interest of time, move forward a little bit, and I'd like to go to a couple of questions from our internet audience again. And we asked the one from Charles earlier, and we thank you, Charles, and others for your questions. Monica, what factors? This is from Monica. What factors does the Corps use to determine river level? How do you gauges? I think is probably what she's asking about.
Well, we have almost 400 river gauges all over the basin. Now, the Missouri Basin is 567,000 square miles. It's a big area with lots of tributaries feeding into the river. But we have stream gauges that are solar powered, that send a signal regularly to a satellite that's bounced back here to Omaha, and we update our reservoir levels and river levels about every 20 minutes based on the satellite information we get. We make decisions daily on how much water to release. The river here in Omaha is a combination of what comes in from the tributaries plus what we release from the reservoirs, and we have targets that we try to meet by making those adjustments.
Very good. And we've got one other question here from Kevin. What was the purpose of the first council with the Indians? Well, that may be a broadcast in of itself, and indeed it will be. We're going to be talking a great deal about Native relations, both between the original expedition and the experiences that we're having among the tribes as we move along the river. But Kevin, I guess to answer your question is that, and we've talked about this in the past, that remember that once France relinquished its claim on Louisiana, the United States government was then in a position that it had to actually begin to negotiate with the sovereign nations, with the tribes along the way. And part of that council's purpose was to inform those tribes of the fact that the United States was the government, the Eurocentric power that would be operating in the area, that the Spanish and the French and the British would no longer be trading with those tribes, and that we would be sending future trade expeditions and that sort of thing to just establish a relationship with those tribes along the way, and also to extend an invitation to leaders of those tribes to make their way back to Washington to meet with President Jefferson. So that would go to that. It sounds like did we have one more question that just came in from our internet audience? Maybe we could take a look at that real quickly and try to answer that. I'll tell you very quickly that next week we'll be broadcasting to you. Excuse me, I want to give you that information. Next week we'll be broadcasting, let me get this out so I make sure I'm telling you correctly. We've got a signature event coming up, and we'll be talking about Fort Atkinson, Boyer Chute, and we'll be talking about the first council. By that time we will have held our first council with the tribes along the way, and not just a reenactment, but indeed a council in of itself. We've been, as you all know, very committed to First Nation issues, and we were excited today to be joined by Mr. Johnson. I want to thank you again, Paul, for being here and trying to shed some light on not only the river but on the Corps, and you know, we try to maintain an objective opinion as we move along the river, and I can tell you in the 8 years that I've been moving on the Missouri River, the river is cleaner than it was, and I'm not simply talking about sediment, that the rivers are cleaner. We feel comfortable as a group getting into the water, which we do a lot. Obviously, the Platte has been a historical river that marks a change in the river, and it always has. The Platte River, and I would encourage teachers and students to read more about the Platte. The Platte is a phenomenal river. It played an important part in the expansion of the West. Many people made it to the Platte and made a hard left there and continued west, and there's a story into its own there. We've seen the efforts of the Corps to undo things that have happened in the past that were when you're manipulating something like the Missouri River, it's always difficult to know what the ramifications of it are, and so we appreciate your efforts to help us be a little more informed about it.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. The river has changed a lot because people's attitudes have changed. You know, as I alluded to before, we really traded a lot of what was on the river that was important habitat for fish and birds for some of the richest farmland on the planet. And today we're saying, well, maybe we went too far. And now we're looking for ways to help recovery of those species, but still enjoy the many benefits we get. And of course, as you get further north, you're going to see that the river changes very significantly once it gets above Yankton, South Dakota.
And we're looking forward to that. The crystal blue waters up there, we can look down and see the walleye running. And listen, we're going to have to run today. We certainly thank our internet audience for joining us. Again, join us next week when we'll be broadcasting from Fort Atkinson, Nebraska. We'll be taking a look at what's happened over the last week historically, as well as in the contemporary expedition. And we're going to be joined there by Matthew Sitting Bear Jones of the Otoe, Missouri, and John Slater, the park superintendent at Fort Atkinson. Look forward to you joining us then, and until then, we proceed on.